Hey everyone, this is Goku's son DBZ. Welcome back for a new collections video of one of my smallest collections, but arguably the most interesting, probably retro console in my collection, and that is the Panasonic 3DO, which was developed with one of the original founders of Electronic Arts. But with that said, the first game of which I have here is arguably the worst of the three fighters I have for the console. It's a really bad, in my opinion, Mortal Kombat clone, but still I like it for the cheesiness and over the top that it is. It's definitely an interesting game that I don't believe has gotten any other console ports. So if you want to play this, either you're going to have to use ROMs on PC, or you're going to have a 3DO. Now the game is surprisingly very affordable, so just know that. Actually, many 3DO games are pretty affordable. It's a relatively, I think, reasonable price console to collect for. Next up, it's an interesting game show game called Twisted, the Game Show. It's definitely not your traditional game show type games on console, I will say. But with that said, it is an interesting experience, in my opinion. Also, of course, done by Electronic Arts. Also, in my opinion, an interesting origins, as this was like the original console version of the original classic Need for Speed. Obviously done by Electronic Arts, of course. It's an interesting experience, to say the least. Next up is arguably the definitive, in my opinion, from personal experience, console version of Road Rash, an all-time arcade classic. This is easily in my top 5 favorite games on the 3DO, at least, that I have in my relatively small collection. But with that said, still is an all-time classic, and I love occasionally, will find myself on occasion going back to when I experienced classic arcade games. Next up is arguably the best way to play the original Samurai Showdown game outside of the Neo Geo, which is an arm and a leg to this day. 3DO is far more affordable and economic nowadays to collect. But with that said, so it's a great experience nevertheless. Next up was only the second ever 3DO game that I had collected. It was the original classic Gex, which I have played on both PS1 and 3DO. Personally, I kind of like the 3DO version a little more, though I played the PS1 version the most. Next up is an interesting little game. It's a puzzle game. Much like other games of its kind, like obviously Super Puzzle Fighter and many other Tetris clones, but still I like it for what it is, and is unique and different from other clones of this time period, with the backgrounds and the designs of the blocks that drop. And I appreciate the actual uniqueness of it. It's definitely probably one of the less well-known, I'd say, clone games of the Tetris kind. As see, it was released in 1995. Next up, an all-time classic jet fighter game from Namco. And that is, of course, Starblade, which you see this startup. The very first level is a brief startup before you start playing Tekken 5. This is the game that you get to play a demo of, and it is actually a great, I think, early jet fighter game, honestly, from this era. Is far superior to the original Star Fox. But then again, admittedly, I'm a little biased, as Namco is one of my favorite developers of all time. I just wish I had also the front cover art, but unfortunately, I picked this up for at least a reasonable price range. It's definitely one of my preferred games. Next up, we go to a game I picked up for $1. And that is a golf game. Now, it's not the greatest golf game, per se. Still, it is decent for what it is, in my personal opinion. Now, it's interesting that EA did not develop this game, interestingly enough. But it is interesting. For this time period, I'd say this is probably one of the better golf games you could have played on home console, that is. It is interesting, like, no one ever talks about this game of the early golf games, surprisingly. Next up is one of the more interesting, I'd say, things I've picked up. Is a collection developed and released by Activision, of all companies. And here's the extra large booklet. I kind of dig the classic art, though it's kind of weird given the three, like, classic style games you get to play in it. Is interesting, though. If you want to play, like, some authentic classic games from the East, this is actually an interesting collection. But it is definitely not your usual modern, like, games you would see from Activision. Next up is a sequel to a classic original launch title called Shockwave II. Now, I wish I had the original jumbo-sized case and all. Now, Shockwave 2 is definitely superior to the first game. I just wish I had a guy originally complete, but still, this is, if you're wanting a decent, experienced jet fighter game, though there's quite a few flight simulation type games and stuff, believe it or not, on the 3DO, that is probably its dominant genre of style games to play. If you like flight, jet fighter simulation type games, you'll probably enjoy the 3DO. But Shockwave is probably one of the best games, in my opinion, in that genre on here. Next up is the second in my top 5 favorite games on the console, and that is the first game I ever played on the 3DO, and that's Dragon Slayer, which is a classic game where the animation and stuff was done by one of my all-time favorite animators, Don Bluth, which of course is very well known for doing All Dogs Go to Heaven, also Anastasia, also can't forget many other classics like The Secret of Nim, my personal all-time favorite, An American Tail, and many others. But yeah, if you've never had a chance and you get a chance to play Dragon Slayer, it is an awesome experience into itself. Next up, the grandfather of classic style puzzle games, and that is the original classic Myst, which you could play on PC, Sega Saturn, and of course 3DO. Sorry about that. But yeah, it is hard to believe how long ago Myst. It's a shame, though, at least it did get a remaster thanks to limited run games. Next up is one of my personal favorite of the jet fighter games on the console. That is Total Eclipse, which is definitely one of the classic and best, actually, games probably on the console. Is definitely unique for its time period when it was released. But it's actually, I think, a pretty good overall experience done by Crystal Dynamics, of course, which also did Gex. And I love the cover art, honestly, of this specific game. I just love it. It gives me, like, Star Trek Deep Space Nine vibes, or Babylon 5 vibes. Arguably, one of the other of my top 5 favorite games is getting to play really the grandfather of survival horror. So many elements from this game would be stolen and used in the original Resident Evil. But yes, it's definitely an all-time classic, and it's a hard game to play all in one sitting. But you have to, because I don't have the special memory unit device to save game progress on this console, as the memory device is more expensive than the console itself, which is absurd. But with that said, and also there's a remake coming out of this game. But yeah, for me, if you're interested in like the early era of survival horror, pre-Resident Evil or Silent Hill and stuff, get a chance, try out the original classic Alone in the Dark. It is genuinely a fascinating experience in my own opinion. Though technically Clock Tower predates it. Next up, a true cult classic, Out of This World, which of course got a remaster physical re-release by, of course, Limited Run Games. But with that said, it is definitely a pretty cool, unique experience. Now, I also have played this on the Vita. It's a great game. It's a great indie game. If you want support or have a really unique platformer experience from the past with a decent difficulty, I recommend actually checking Out of This World. This game is starting to go up now for the 3DO, surprisingly. Now, the last are of my personal favorite games in my collection, of course. This is pretty much the definitive way to play a lot of definitely the audio mixing and stuff. To me, this remains the gold standard of the original early era multi versions of Street Fighter 2. This is probably the definitive version of the early era of Street Fighter. If you're wanting some really cool remixes and stuff on the audio files, this is arguably, in my opinion, the best version. And this has come from someone who has played 9 versions of Street Fighter 2. That's how much I love this game. I've gone out of my way to get as many versions as I can. And I actually love this cover here with Akuma on the cover art. But yeah, seriously, if you ever get a chance to experience the original classic Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, take it. Now, the last 3 are the only ones I have complete in like long boxes. And the first was, of course, I talked about the sequel, which I really enjoyed. Sadly, this game is inferior in pretty much every way, but still is really cool, and the price was very reasonable. So, I couldn't resist that, and for complete in box, as these boxes are freaking huge. And this is the early area with, of course, live action clips and stuff, which I appreciate all the cheesiness and B-rated feel that it has. I actually really appreciate. Second to last, another pretty cool experience if you want when it comes to Jet Fighter games and stuff. This is definitely one of the cool experiences, and again, I absolutely love the cover art on these cases. Like, you just don't get stuff like this nowadays. Like, it started with the Atari 2600, and to me, the 3DO is one of the last consoles actually use this cool art style. Besides these ridiculously oversized boxes, I just appreciate it for the unique experience into itself. That's really what a 3DO is. Besides getting to play some really cool games that have never actually seen a re-release on a modern consoles, which is unfortunate, and this is one of those games. Last but not least, probably one of the best, at least graphically speaking at the time, one of the best looking Jet Fighter games you could play on the 3DO, and that being VR Stalker. 360 Air Combat Simulator. Really, this game, a lot of people may not know, but this game actually paved the way for games like Ace Combat and many others of the future, which would far surpass this. But for the time, in my opinion, this is actually a really cool experience. By today's standards, graphically, it's horrible, but as somebody who grew up playing like classic Jet Fighter games on like the Windows 95 and everything, I appreciate this kind of stuff. Would love to get my hands on one of those, but, well, the prices are kind of ridiculous. But yeah, it's cool to see all the original stuff in this case. But anyways, with that said, I'll see y'all next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel, and stay safe out there in YouTube land.